The valley lay bare beneath a grey sky, the wind restless as it scraped across the fences and rattled the loose tin nailed above the barn. Dust moved in thin spirals across the yard, gathering in the corners of the porch where a rocking chair creaked with each push of the breeze. Elias Grant stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders bent slightly as though even the wind pressed upon him. 5 winters had passed since he buried his wife under the cartonwoods near the creek. 5 winters of tending cattle alone, speaking only to horses and tools, listening each night to silence fill every gap in the house. Loneliness was no longer a visitor, it had become the very air he breathed. When the stagecoach wheels ground against the dirt road and the horses tossed their heads, Elias's heart thudded in a way it had not for years. He wiped his palms against his trousers, searching for hope inside himself. The letters he had written, careful, awkward words scrawled late at night by lamplight, had carried across states, and the reply had come, promising companionship. He had imagined a softer voice in the kitchen, footsteps passing through empty rooms, the ghost of warmth returning. But when the coach door opened and a figure stepped down, all the air seemed to leave him. Helena was not the fragile, blushing bride he had pictured in his imagination. She stood taller than him, shoulders square, her figure casting a shadow over him as if the sun itself had chosen her side. Her face carried lines cut not by vanity but by labor and endurance. Her hands, visible even in the chill, bore scars that no needlework could hide. A woman weathered by hardship, not softened by it. Elias felt himself shrink, not only in her presence but inside his own chest. All the small comforts he had painted in his mind peeled away in that instant. He forced a smile, awkward, as the driver set Helena's trunk down with a grunt and a puff of dust. Elias said, his voice quieter than he intended. Helena inclined her head, not bowing, not lowering herself. Her shawl clung to her shoulders, pulled close against the valley wind. She met his eyes only briefly, and in that moment Elias caught not defiance but weariness, a guardedness born of disappointment that mirrored his own. She had travelled far, and she had known loneliness too. He could see it in the way she held her breath before stepping forward. He carried her trunk into the house, setting it by the stairway where the boards creaked loud beneath its weight. The air inside smelled of wood smoke, old coffee grounds, and silence too long kept. Helena's eyes swept the room, noting the absence of touches that made a house into a home. No flowers on the sill, no embroidery on the walls, only a cedar chest tucked in the corner, its lid shut tight. Elias busied himself with the stove, rattling pots though he had nothing much to cook. He brewed coffee, the bitter kind he drank daily, and set 2 tin cups on the table. The silence pressed harder than the storm clouds gathering above the ridges. He wanted to speak, to welcome her, to explain himself, to soften the cold edges of the moment, but the words scattered before they reached his tongue. Helena sat down at the table, her shawl still drawn about her shoulders as though she had not yet decided whether she belonged here. Her hands folded loosely before her, scarred knuckles pressed together. She took the coffee when offered but did not drink. Her gaze wandered the room with a measured stillness, her expression unreadable. Elias lowered himself into the chair across from her, feeling the gap between them widen though only a wooden table stood there. He glanced at her face, then away. The disappointment that pricked him was followed at once by guilt. She had come far, leaving behind whatever life she had known, only to find his uncertainty written plain across his expression. For a long while, neither spoke. The wind worried at the eaves, the fire hissed in the stove, and the rocking chair outside creaked as if mocking them both. Helena finally lifted the cup to her lips, tasted the bitterness, and set it down without a sound. Her eyes flicked to Elias, and he felt exposed, as though she had read the whole of his doubt in that glance. He looked down at his hands, calloused from years of fence work, roughened by reins and rope. He thought of the letters, the promises implied, the hope he had carried that some gentler fate might meet him here. Instead, he found himself staring at a woman who unsettled him, who filled the room in a way his loneliness never had. Helena drew her shawl tighter. She had known rejection before. Elias did not yet know the details, but the way she braced herself told him enough. She understood already that his welcome was cold, that his silence carried more than shyness. And so she answered his hesitation with her own, withdrawing behind the wall she had built long before stepping off the coach. The coffee cooled, the fire sank lower, and night crept through the windows without either of them finding words to bridge the distance. Elias realized then that companionship would not arrive easily, not with this woman, not with the ghost still standing between them. And Helena, gazing at the stark walls of the house she had crossed miles to reach, understood she had not traded loneliness for warmth, but for another silence, different in shape, yet no less heavy. Snow began to fall in the valley, soft at first, then steady, cloaking the ranch in a muffled stillness that seemed to deepen the silence already rooted there. Each morning Helena woke before dawn, her breath clouding in the cold air of the upstairs room, and braided her hair by the faint glow of the lamp. She moved about the house with measured steps, as though she were testing the strength of the floorboards, learning the rhythm of walls that were not yet hers. She laid her shawl across the rocking chair on the porch, its dark wool shifting gently when the wind pressed against it, and went about the chores with a resolve that seemed as much armor as duty. Elias watched her often from doorways or from across the yard. She unsettled him, not because she spoke harshly, she rarely spoke at all, but because her presence filled spaces that had belonged to memory. She bent to the fire in the same way his late wife once had, her hair caught by lamplight in familiar patterns. At times, comfort stirred in him at the sight, but just as quickly a kind of torment followed, for Helena was not his wife, nor was she the gentle bride he had once imagined might come to chase away his solitude. She was a woman who carried her own history in the set of her shoulders, in the way her gaze lingered on the horizon, as if she listened for voices no one else could hear. Helena's hands told stories Elias did not ask for. Scars ran along the knuckles, thin white marks like chalk lines on wood. Her fingers were thickened from labor, more used to lifting stone or turning soil than to embroidery or music. He had learned, in pieces, what had brought her here. A husband crushed in a mine collapse, a life buried alongside him. The town she came from had turned its eyes away, whispering that she was not fit for a second marriage, that her size and strength made her something less than womanly. Such judgments had driven her westward, into a future that offered more questions than promises. Elias, too, bore his ghosts. The cedar chest in the corner held his late wife's wedding dress, folded carefully away though time had already yellowed the lace. He could not bring himself to part with it, though every glance at its outline beneath the cedar lid hollowed him further. In the barn, tools still hung where he and his wife had once worked side by side, her touch still clung to them in memory, though her hand would never grip them again. Each object seemed a stone tied to him, keeping him from rising, binding him to years that refused to fade. It was during one quiet evening, when snow pressed against the windows and the fire snapped low in the stove, that Helena stumbled upon his hidden relic. She had been putting away linens, stacking them neatly, her broad frame filling the hallway as she bent over the cedar chest. When she lifted the lid, the air seemed to shift. She paused, her breath caught, then reached in with careful fingers. The dress lay there like a ghost, lace delicate against the cedar's dark interior. She lifted it only enough to see it fully, the fabric sliding soft against her hands, before folding it back into place with a gentleness that surprised even herself. Elias had been standing in the shadows of the stairwell, watching without intending to. His throat tightened as shame rose hot and merciless. He felt as though she had seen into the deepest wound he carried, a place he had hidden from everyone, including himself. Yet Helena said nothing. She closed the lid quietly, set the linens on top, and moved away as though she had touched nothing at all. The silence between them that night felt heavier than the snow pressing down on the roof. He wanted to speak, to explain, to ask forgiveness for what she had stumbled upon, but words died before they left him. She, too, remained silent, carrying her own ghosts close, unwilling to open them where they might be misunderstood. Two wounded pasts had brushed together in that moment, her scars, his memories, yet no binding thread had formed. Instead, they stood apart, two figures framed in firelight and shadow, measuring each other against what was lost, and against what might never be found. The house, cloaked in snow and silence, seemed to breathe their grief back at them, reminding them that no new life could grow while the old still lingered so strong. The storm rose without warning, a black wall sweeping down from the mountains, snow and wind tumbling together like a host of spirits bent on erasing every line of the land. Elias had seen storms before, but this one seemed to roar with intent, as though it carried some message from the past. The cattle bellowed against the fence, the barn doors rattled on their hinges, and the air turned white with driving snow. He was fastening a shutter when Helena's voice rang out, sharp against the gale. At first he thought she called only to warn him of the storm's force. But when he turned, he saw her bent near the fence, her shawl whipping in the wind, arms wrapped around something that did not belong there. It was a boy, small against her frame, his weight sagging against her as though his legs could carry him no farther. Snow had already gathered on his braids, his dark hair matted with blood where a rifle ball had grazed deep into his shoulder. His breath came in ragged gasps, clouding the frozen air. Elias froze, his heart hammering. The sight of braids, of brown skin against the snow, struck him with old fear. Memories rose sharp as knives, neighbors cut down in raids, warnings passed from one ranch to another that no settler was safe on the frontier's edge. The instinct was to retreat, to bolt the door, to let the storm swallow what danger it had delivered. But Helena stood taller in that moment than the storm itself. She lifted the boy with a strength that startled Elias, half carrying, half dragging him toward the porch. When Elias tried to speak, to protest, she cut him with a look and words carved from stone. "He will not die here." The decision was made. Elias found himself following, though each step felt heavier than the last. Inside, the house filled with the wild breath of the storm as Helena forced the door shut behind them. She set the boy on the floor near the fire, his blood dripping onto the worn boards like ink spilled on parchment. The flames snapped, casting long shadows, as Helena tore at his shirt to reveal the wound. Elias stood useless for a moment, then forced himself to fetch bandages, his hands clumsy. Doubt gnawed at him. What if others followed? What if the boy's kin saw shelter as betrayal, or the neighbors saw it as treachery? Yet as he returned, the sight before him gave him pause. Helena knelt with sleeves rolled high, her broad frame bent over the child with the care of one who had known loss too well. She worked with a steady calm, cleaning the wound with rag and water, binding the torn flesh as though nothing else in the world mattered. The boy whimpered, his braid slipping across his cheek, sticky with blood and melted snow. Helena brushed them back, her fingers unexpectedly gentle against his fevered skin. Elias, standing in the firelight, saw the braids not as a mark of fear but as a symbol of something fragile, heritage, youth, life itself, threatened but unbroken. He knelt at last, passing her what she needed, though his reluctance showed in every movement. His eyes flicked to the door, to the windows fogged with frost, to the dark beyond where vengeance might be gathering. Yet each time he looked back, Helena's face anchored him. Her expression was not defiance but guardianship, a fierce refusal to let the storm, or men, or fate take what still could be saved. When at last the boy lay swaddled in blankets before the fire, his breathing eased, Helena leaned back, sweat on her brow, her shawl fallen from her shoulders. Elias caught himself staring, not at her size this time, nor at the scars that marked her hands, but at the certainty she carried, the strength that sheltered them both. In that moment he realized her towering presence did not diminish him as he feared. It shielded, as a great tree shields the earth beneath from lightning. The storm raged on through the night, shaking the windows, moaning in the chimney. But within those walls, another kind of storm had begun to pass. Elias, his fears still present but softened, saw Helena not as a mistake, not as a shadow of what he had lost, but as something unexpected, someone who could hold fast when he faltered. And though neither spoke of it, both knew that with the boy's arrival, the silence of the ranch had changed forever. The storm had bound them, fragile though the truce might be, into a household no longer shaped only by loneliness, but by the fragile, perilous act of sheltering life against the odds. The storm did not break quickly. Days passed, each one folded into the next, until snow stacked high against the windows and the fences vanished beneath white drifts. The land beyond the ranch disappeared into silence, leaving three souls pressed beneath one roof. Within those walls the air grew close, heavy not just with the smoke of the fire but with unspoken thoughts. Silence became louder than the storm itself, a silence weighted with the strain of endurance. The boy lay on a cot drawn near the stove, his fever breaking slowly, his wound cleaned and dressed beneath Helena's firm hand. She moved around him with steady patience, feeding him broth spoon by spoon, keeping the fire alive through long hours, stitching his torn shirt with the awkward precision of someone more used to mending leather than cloth. Elias watched her, always from a step removed, his doubts gnawing at him even as he could not turn away. She seemed to carry the boy as though he were her own blood, and Elias felt a stir of shame each time he remembered how close he had come to leaving the child to the storm. Whispers of danger circled his mind as he worked in the barn or lay restless at night. The boy's people would surely come searching, and when they found him here, what then? The valley had long lived in fragile balance, settler and Apache in uneasy standoff, both sides hardened by memory of blood spilled. Elias had heard too many stories of raids, too many warnings not to shelter the wounded. Reprisal was always a shadow waiting to fall. Yet Helena never faltered. She tended to the boy with a calm resolve, her shawl drawn close around her shoulders like a banner, as if she declared to the world beyond those snowbound walls, "He will live, and I will not yield." Elias felt himself shrink beside such certainty. He had known how to mend fences, to break horses, to toil sun-up to sundown, but when faced with danger he found himself wavering. At night, when the chores were done and the fire burned low, he would sit in the rocking chair by the window, listening to the chair's creak keep time with his thoughts. He listened to the boy's breathing steady at last, a fragile rhythm against the storm's moan. And he watched Helena by firelight, her tall frame bent slightly as she loosened her braid, combed her thick hair with deliberate strokes, and bound it up again for sleep. In those moments, Elias's heart twisted with contradiction. Shame at his cowardice, for he had been willing to shut the door on the boy. Longing, fierce and bewildering, for the nearness of the woman who now filled his house with strength instead of absence. And fear not of her size, nor of the scars that marked her hands, but of what it would mean to let her inside the walls he had built around his grief. He had waited for gentleness to return to his life, but what had arrived was something else: endurance, dignity, a kind of love that did not whisper but stood tall, silent, and immovable. Helena said little to him in those days, but the weight of her presence pressed against him in ways he could not deny. When she brushed the boy's hair back from his face, when she shifted the log in the stove so the flame would not falter, when she set her shawl on the chair at day's end, each action became a marker of survival, of will. She did not ask Elias to be stronger than he was, but her steadiness left him with no excuse to remain small. The house breathed with the tension of their silence, the creak of wood and the hiss of fire filling spaces where words might have gone. The snow did not relent, but inside those walls something began to take shape, uncertain, unspoken, yet undeniable. Elias began to see Helena not as the mistake he had feared, nor as the shadow of his late wife, but as a presence both heavy and necessary. A force of survival, a dignity he could lean on even when his own knees threatened to give way. Love did not come as he had once imagined, carried on gentle whispers and soft hands. It came instead through endurance, through the shared burden of keeping life alive against storm and silence. And though neither admitted it aloud, each knew that the weight they carried beneath that roof was no longer theirs alone. The thaw began with the slow drip of snow melt from the eaves, rivulets cutting through the drifts, the sound of water marking the turning of the season. Grass showed in patches, dull and bent, and the fences emerged from beneath their burial of ice. But with the thaw came another kind of danger, less predictable than winter itself. One afternoon, while the boy dozed in the sunlit corner of the room, the sound of hooves approached, more than one horse, their rhythm heavy, purposeful. Elias stepped to the porch, heart tightening, and saw a group of men ride into the yard, rifles across their saddles, their faces hard as stone. They were settlers from the valley, men he knew by sight though not by friendship, their families scarred by raids. They came with the brittle righteousness of those who had suffered, yet their eyes burned with something beyond justice, vengeance, sharp and unyielding. The leader spoke first, his voice rough as gravel. The boy was to be handed over. He called it justice, but the gleam of steel in his hands betrayed the truth. Elias's stomach knotted. Alone, he might have yielded, reasoning with himself that one life was not worth the wrath of neighbors, that peace was best kept through sacrifice. But before he could speak, Helena stepped forward. She shed her shawl, casting it across the porch rail as though discarding hesitation itself, and stood tall in the open air, the wind tugging at her braid. Her voice, when it came, was calm yet iron-bound. "He stays." The men shifted in their saddles, startled by the certainty in her tone, by the way she towered without flinching. Elias felt himself steadied, lifted almost, as though her height and her strength cast a shield over him too. He found himself standing beside her, not ahead, not behind, but at her side. Together they met the men's eyes without lowering their own. The standoff stretched, the air tense, every sound sharp, the creak of leather, the groan of the porch, the low crackle of melting ice. No bullets flew. Perhaps it was Helena's unflinching gaze, perhaps the sheer refusal that radiated from them both, but the men faltered. They spat curses, turned their reins, and rode back into the dusk, their silhouettes swallowed by the fading light. When the sound of hooves had gone, Elias realized his hands were trembling. Helena bent, picked up her shawl, and laid it once more on her shoulders, as though nothing had happened. Yet in his chest something had shifted. For the first time in years, he felt not only the weight of fear but also the strange, steadying lift of standing firm. That night the fire burned low, its glow spilling across the room in restless shadows. The boy slept soundly for the first time since his arrival, his breath easy, his wound healing. Elias sat across from Helena, the silence between them no longer heavy but waiting, expectant. Words gathered in him, words he had buried for too long. At last they came. He told her of his wife, of the sickness that had taken her swiftly and left him broken, of how he had shrunk inside himself until the walls of his own house felt like prison bars. He confessed the shame that gnawed at him, the fear that he was too small, too hollow to be worthy of companionship again. The words cracked as they left him, but they did not falter. Helena listened, her hands resting on her knees, her face softened by firelight. When he finished, she drew a breath that trembled only once. Then she spoke, not of comfort, but of truth. She told him of her own years of rejection, of how neighbors had turned their eyes away, saying she was too large, too coarse, too unfeminine for any man to claim. She spoke of nights when loneliness was a weight heavier than stone, of her husband lost to the earth, of the whispers that drove her westward. Her words did not falter either. They were laid down like stones on the ground, each one heavy, each one unmovable. And when she fell silent, Elias reached across the table. His hand found hers, scar meeting scar, callus against callus. For a moment neither moved. The fire crackled between them, not wild, not consuming, but steady. It was not passion, not yet. It was recognition. Two souls marked by loss, meeting not in promise but in endurance. The fire on the hearth, low and enduring, became their symbol, not the flame that devours, but the one that keeps a home alive through winter. Together they sat, hand to hand, while the night pressed close outside, and for the first time the silence around them felt less like emptiness and more like shelter. Spring loosened its grip slowly, as though reluctant to release the valley from winter's hold. Snow thinned into streams that trickled down gullies, and fences that had vanished under drifts emerged again, their rails dark with meltwater. The air carried the scent of thawed earth, sharp and raw, as if the land itself had taken a long breath. With the season's change came the reckoning they had known would arrive. The boy's kin appeared at dawn, shapes moving along the ridgeline, quiet as shadows against the pale sky. Elias and Helena stood together on the porch, the boy hovering just behind them, his wound healed but his body still frail. The riders descended without a sound of war drums or raised rifles, their presence neither hostile nor welcoming, but watchful. The air seemed cut thin by their silence, and Elias felt the old fear stir inside him, the memory of stories told around fires about raids, vengeance, and death. Helena's shawl snapped in the wind, her height making her seem a banner planted in the earth. Elias reached across, steadied her hand, not because she needed it but because he did. Together they walked into the yard, the ground wet beneath their boots, the thawing soil soft enough to hold the imprint of every step. The boy's kin dismounted. They looked at Elias and Helena without expression, their dark eyes deep as wells, unreadable. The boy stepped forward, hesitating only once before crossing the space between them. The silence stretched, so taut it could have broken at the sound of a breath. Elias braced for anger, for the possibility of reprisal, but none came. The Apache leader, face carved by weather and years, touched the boy's shoulder, then lifted his gaze to the pair who had sheltered him. There were no words of gratitude, nor were there threats. Only a long, measuring pause, as though they weighed not only what had been done but who Elias and Helena had chosen to be. And then, with quiet finality, they turned and rode away, the boy with them, his figure growing smaller until it was only another shadow swallowed by the hills. Elias let out the breath he had been holding. Relief flooded him, but it carried something deeper than safety. The danger was gone, yes, but so too was the fear that had once ruled him. Standing beside Helena, he no longer saw her as the woman who had unsettled his home or dwarfed his presence. He saw the woman who had lifted the boy from the snow without hesitation, who had faced rifles without flinching, who had stood beside him when his knees might have buckled. The valley was quiet again, but it no longer felt empty. Days slipped forward, and weeks later when the stagecoach rumbled past on its way west, Elias did not feel the tug he once had to climb aboard to escape the silence of his own house. The porch no longer seemed barren, the rocking chair bore Helena's shawl like a claim of belonging. The cedar chest still held his wife's dress, but it had become only a memory folded in cloth, not a ghost haunting the rooms. The fire on the hearth burned steady, not for remembrance but for life yet to come. Elias worked the fences as the land dried, Helena at his side, her long strides keeping pace with his. She spoke little, as she always had, but her presence carried weight enough to steady him. And when the thaw had turned the valley green again, Elias saddled his horse. Helena mounted hers with ease, her figure casting a long shadow across the grass. They rode side by side through the valley, the air sweet with spring, the mountains still crowned in white. They were not master and bride, not man diminished and woman too large. They were two souls weathered and scarred, who had chosen each other not with promises or whispered romance, but through silence and endurance, through fire and fear and the unspoken vow of protection. Elias glanced across the saddle, caught Helena's profile in the morning light, and felt a quiet certainty settle into him. He did not need to be taller, braver, or different than he was. He only needed to keep riding beside her. And she, with a faint curve at the corner of her mouth, seemed to know. The thawing valley stretched ahead, wide and uncertain, but no longer empty. They rode into it together, not as what they had been, but as what they had chosen. Two lives carried forward, against all odds, by the simple, unyielding act of endurance and love.